مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. أعلن الرئيس الروسي فلاديمير بوتين أن روسيا ستوقف شحنات الغاز والنفط للدول التي ستحدد سقفا للأسعار. بالتزامن اقترحت الهيئة التنفيذية للاتحاد الأوروبي تحديد سقف لسعر الغاز الروسي في غضون ساعات من إدانة الرئيس الروسي للفكرة ووصفها بالغباء. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة ينضم إلينا أولريك بروكنر أستاذ الدراسات الأوروبية بجامعة ستانفورد في برلين. سيد بروكنر مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you.
دعنا نبدأ بآخر التطورات، تحديد سقف لأسعار النفط الروسي. هذه الفكرة ما الذي تعنيه؟ هل سيكون هناك سعران للنفط، أحدهما لروسيا والآخر حسب أسعار السوق الدولية؟
Well, as far as I can see, this is more wishful thinking that the G7 and supported by the United States representative play with the idea that there should be something like an energy cap to make it easier for Western countries to deal with the current situation and most importantly for the winter. But how that practically works and how it is implemented and what are the long-term implications, this remains to be seen.
طيب حتى نفهم منك أكثر، إذا ما تم تطبيق الفكرة في البداية قد تؤتي ثمارها، الطلب سيتحول بعدها إلى النفط الأرخص ثم ترفع زيادة الطلب السعر من جديد. هل تدور أوروبا هنا وأمريكا في حلقة مفرغة؟
So far, it was just announced as a thought. It's not like a detailed plan in which they explain in detail what exactly the measures will be to cap the price. From how I understand the proposal, it affects the contracts with Russia. It doesn't automatically affect the international oil price. Right now, the prices are too high for the industries and the households to survive the winter. It will have far-reaching social and economic problems, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. So something needs to be done. And there are many ways what could be done, including today's decision by the central bank to increase the interest rate. This will hopefully lead to a lower inflation rate, and with a lower inflation rate, the costs will be lower, but it also comes with a number of other unintended consequences. So for now, this is a proposal, but how it practically affects international oil prices or energy prices in general, this remains to be seen.
موسكو قالت إنها لن تبيع للدول التي تلتزم بسقف أسعار على نفطها. هل تتفادى بذلك العقوبات؟ هل هذا ممكن أساساً؟
Well, we are in some sort of an economic war situation. On the one hand, the Western alliance doesn't want to put boots on the ground and be a party of war in Ukraine, but they express their unlimited solidarity with Ukraine. And so all they can do is to impose financial and economic sanctions. These sanctions don't stay unresponded by Russia. And what Russia is trying to do is to confuse the West, to threaten the West, to increase energy prices, and to see to what extent the West will be able to stand united if things get more complicated. And there are many ways how things can get complicated. What that practically means, like who's having the upper hand or the better leverage, this again remains to be seen because it depends on a number of circumstances that no one can predict, including the weather and how long and how hard the winter is going to be.
طيب سقف الأسعار لماذا لا يطبق مثلا على الغاز المسال الأمريكي؟ سعره مرتفع جدا على الأوروبيين، أليس كذلك؟
Well, first of all, it was important to fill the gas storage in Europe. And given the high energy dependency that many European countries chose to take as a risk, and now it fires back, makes it much more important to have gas supply and not so much to think about what exactly is the costs. The German government, as well as other governments like Italy, were traveling all around the world to find alternative gas suppliers to diversify the energy mix in Europe. And if the United States are willing to jump in and to send gas through liquefied natural gas ports, which also not all countries have access to, then it's far better to be prepared for the winter than discussing what exactly is the price.
باعتقادك مع وقف الغاز الروسي لأوروبا، هل اتجهت موسكو لتسليح الإمدادات رداً على العقوبات الغربية؟
Well, Russia is in a complicated situation. It doesn't really have another business model than selling gas and oil. And oil is easy to sell to other customers because you can just ship it around the world. And so far, there is enough ship capacity to find alternatives, while gas comes through pipelines. It's only a small percentage that is shipped by liquefied natural gas ports. And so it's very difficult for Russia to immediately switch from its dependency on European markets to alternatives like India and China. They announce it, but what we see from satellite pictures is that Russia started to burn off gas because they don't know what to do with it.
هل يمكن لأوروبا أن تقف صامدة أمام توقف الغاز الروسي؟ ما هي بدائل الأوروبيين؟
It certainly can. It will come with a high price, and it will not just affect Europe, but given the state of globalization in which we are all dependent on each other, it will affect the global economy, and therefore it could even lead to something like a global recession. This we don't know yet because we don't know what the next steps will be and how hard Europe will be hit and how it affects global supply chains.
عندما نتحدث عن أسعار باهظة تدفعها أوروبا، أنت تقصد ماذا؟ عن تخليها عن سياسات البيئة هذا الشتاء أم عن مصانع وقطاعات سيتم إغلاقها؟ ما المقصود هنا بالضبط؟
Well, we talk about everything. First of all, when we look at the composition of where does our electricity comes from, then at the moment, coal is the number one source to produce electricity. This is exactly the opposite of what the current Green and Social Democrat government in Germany announced when they were elected a year ago. That's the number one priority for Germany, and not only for Germany, but Europe and ideally for the rest of the world, is to fight climate change. So burning fossil fuels is exactly the opposite of what we need at a situation when it is about the survival of the human species on a planet that can't provide the living conditions if global warming reaches a point that is getting out of control. Aside from climate change, we will definitely see social turmoil in European countries because not everyone is affected equally. Those who can afford to pay higher prices for energy just face a higher bill and they pay it. But there is something like energy poverty that is spreading in Europe, not only within countries, but also in the difference between the relatively rich core and the periphery countries. So this will be a major challenge for the solidarity. It's a stress test for solidarity in the European Union. And we will see different companies and different sectors being more or less affected by the energy costs because of the rising inflation. It's not only a cost pressure coming from the high energy costs, but also labor is getting more expensive. And we still struggle with the consequences of the pandemic that ruined supply chains that are still waiting to be repaired. And that was already a major problem that made European Union countries to put together a package of 750 billion euros to relaunch the suffering economy after the pandemic. And right at the moment when we start to hope for recovery, the war in Ukraine puts an even bigger problem on the table that needs to be addressed instantly.
في هذا السياق، ماذا عن خطة الاتحاد الأوروبي لحماية المستهلكين من ارتفاع أسعار الطاقة، وكذلك السياسات التي أعلنتها بعض الدول الأوروبية على حدة، هل تعتقد أنها فعالة؟
Well, what we have seen so far is that Western societies are much more robust when it comes to stand united, when everybody understands what the problem is and what needs to be done. This could be seen in the migration situation after 2015-16, when the West offered a solution, and the same could be seen in the pandemic, in which not the worst case scenario became a reality, that a large number of small and medium-sized enterprises got bankrupt, but the states managed to keep them economically alive and put packages together to support them to hold their breath until the situation is getting better. We are hoping to see something similar happening now, but of course there is also a difference between countries that can afford this and others who will end up being massively indebted in a situation in which the European Central Bank is increasing the interest rate, which makes refinancing of public debt extremely expensive, which again leads to social tensions and problems within societies that will turn into a hot winter, that people express their dissatisfaction with what the government is doing or how it's been done or how fast. And that will be a stress test for the survival of a number of governments.
البارحة وزير الطاقة الهندي أكد أنه يشعر بواجب أخلاقي تجاه المستهلكين في الهند عندما حاولت مذيعة في قناة غربية أن تحرجه بتذكيره بواجبها الأخلاقي تجاه أوكرانيا إذا ما اختارت الهند استيراد الغاز أو النفط الروسي. هل الساسة الأوروبيون لديهم معايير أخلاقية مختلفة تجاه مواطنيهم؟
Well, it is difficult to use moral standards when it comes to international affairs, because as much as one can understand why a member of the Indian government cares most for his people and not for the solidarity with the suffering people of Ukraine, it is equally understandable that the West doesn't want to give in and give up Ukraine by finding a dirty deal with Russia, like we lift sanctions and then you let grain transport reach poor countries that are dependent on the export of food from Russia and from Ukraine, because that is another leverage that Putin most likely will use in the near future. So there are a number of conflicting rationales and moral standards, and I don't think that it really leads any far to put pressure on countries like India for using the opportunity to import cheaper energy in times in which India is also suffering on a number of fields.
طيب ماذا عن الضغوط على أوبك بلس للمساعدة في حل أزمة ليست من صنعها؟
I don't know if it helps to pressure them, but they should definitely see the opportunity that would come from a constructive solution in which they offer help, not only for an act of solidarity or out of altruism, but if they intensify their relations with Western countries or important investors for a transition of their economic model, like investing into hydrogen or other green energies and renewables, then this would be a long-term plan in which a short-term expression of solidarity or a constructive approach will in the long run pay off.
بروفيسور أولريك برينكر أستاذ الدراسات الأوروبية في جامعة ستانفورد في برلين، شكرا جزيلا للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thanks for having me.
مشاهدينا شكرا على طيب المتابعة، إلى الملتقى.